Skirmishes, dungeons, and raids, endgame content in many MMORPGs, often large-scale, team-based challenges where a mix of players with different classes, skills, and specializations work together to take down a massive multi-mechanic boss and earn some epic loot. Now, usual design has dungeons and raids as the content you reach after hours and hours of early game grinding, but I think dungeon and raid-like experiences should be available for all players from the very start of an MMORPG. People are often saying the MMO has become less social and we need to find ways to help encourage player interaction, mechanics which facilitate the whole multiplayer element of the MMO acronym. Then there are players saying they feel apprehensive about being thrown into multiplayer content and not quite knowing what to do, being given a sudden surge of responsibility for other players. And then you have old players lament how they can't team up with their lower level mates because there's very little content which applies to both of them. Well, early game dungeons and raids could potentially address all of these things without compromising the solo experience. So, let's discuss. Welcome, I'm Josh Dreyfus. I've played a lot of MMORPGs, and one of the design choices I see most often, a trope of the genre if you will, is dungeons and raids need to be endgame content, as in you must slog through the rest of the game to get to them. And I find this a shame, because dungeons and raids are some of the best experiences you can have in an MMORPG. They facilitate multiplayer content, allowing you to team up with your friends or the community as a whole. They're also a great way of teaching new players mechanics, both relevant to their class and relevant to the in-game environment specifically. If your game is going to become about dungeons and raids, then setting that as the foundation is a really good starting point. You build off what your game will become with a simpler version of what it will become. New players that are joining your MMO for the first time, or experienced players coming from another game to yours, don't want to feel that they're playing through an irrelevant section of your game before getting to the good bit, what it could be. People don't want to feel like your early game is filler, and one of the best ways to make players feel that they are always playing something relevant is to allow dungeons, raids, or multiplayer group content to be available from the very start. Before we begin, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You've been asking if I'll put the Patreon names on 2 pages. No, I won't. The text will just keep getting smaller. More information on how you can support at the end. For now, let's talk dungeons. To understand why I feel this element of MMO design needs to be pushed far more, we need to understand the strengths of player choice in roleplay games, the strengths of player interaction and ease of access in multiplayer games, and how they combine within MMOs. Let's start with the basic foundational strength of the RPG genre. We're not going to look at multiplayer yet. Take some of the greatest RPGs of all time: Baldur's Gate, Morrowind, The Witcher 3. They all focus on allowing the player to explore a variety of gameplay styles and taking on challenges with a slight personal touch. Are you focusing on magic or melee, light armor or heavy armor? Are you slow and calculated, or brash and aggressive? But beyond that, they are designed so the player gets to experience the strength of the game relatively early on. If the game is focused on narrative choices like Baldur's Gate, you'll be making narrative choices quickly. If it's focused on tracking and hunting monsters like in The Witcher 3, you'll be tracking and hunting a griffin as your first task. If it's about encouraging open world exploration like Morrowind, you'll be sent off to join a guild. These are gameplay elements the game will build on for the rest of the game because they value them. They lay the foundation for the groundwork for what the game will become very early. Put simply, if an RPG game knows that its endgame experience is a certain type of gameplay, it will prepare you as a player for that type of gameplay from the start. It may even use a more toned-down, simplistic version of that gameplay as the training in itself. There's a reason that single-player RPGs don't pad themselves out with kill 10 of this or collect 10 of this, because they know that design is padding and not necessarily engaging. If the game itself is a giant challenge, everything it will give you is preparation and training to take on that challenge at the end. MMORPGs have great challenges at the end game. It's just such a shame that the early and mid-game experience is less about preparing for the challenge and more about wasting the player's time until they reach the challenge. Now let's look at some of the more popular multiplayer games, not necessarily RPGs, just multiplayer experiences like Minecraft, Fortnite or League of Legends. In this footage specifically, me playing Fall Guys. bear with me, this does make sense. I believe one of the greatest strengths of these games is you can invite your friends to play and be playing with them almost immediately. You tell them about an awesome new game you found or a game you've played for years, they download it, and then you're gaming together. You may be highly skilled, they may be a beginner, or you may both be beginners, but you can play together. And here's the important touch. You can both do the thing that the game is good at or is known for quickly. You can build in Minecraft, you can start shooting in Apex Legends. These games do not make you play through hours of early content before rewarding you with their best. For example, with Fall Guys, it took me about 30 seconds from launching the game to finding a game and playing with the community. Now, I know that MMORPGs are much more complicated, but what we're looking at here is the multiplayer aspect of playing with other people easily. And now I'd like to ask a simple question. When you're talking to your friends about MMORPGs that you have played, reliving the epic adventures that you have had, and you're trying to convince them to come and play with you, what kind of things do you talk about? Now, I broadly see people bring up two main topics when trying to advertise their MMO experience, either difficult achievements they have worked toward and completed which they're proud of, like killing a boss, or finally getting a rare achievement, finishing a jumping puzzle, or crafting a mythic item, which would make sense because the RPG element is designed to value this progression, or they talk about multiplayer experiences they've had with friends, from chilled, relaxed evenings chopping trees and fishing together, or more dramatic evenings delving into dungeons or hunting rare loot in dangerous places, which makes sense again because MMOs are multiplayer games. The strongest and most powerful personal anecdotes, though, are often combinations of both of them, overcoming difficult challenges with your friends, like beating a boss together. When you're trying to convince your non-MMO playing friends to come and join you, you will tell them about all the amazing stuff that you can go and do together. Multiplayer experiences such as dungeons and raids. But what then happens when that person joins the game for the first time and realizes they are hours, days, in some cases weeks away of both the experience and being able to team up with you? More often than not, when a new friend joins a new MMORPG, they now have to go through hours and hours of early game before reaching the fun bit that you were talking about or that you are at. And it's very hard to keep the energy and enthusiasm of, yeah, it's going to be amazing, we're going to go on adventures together, when you know you're following it up with, but first, several hours, possibly weeks, of early game grind. I had this exact experience when I tried to invite new friends to play essentially any MMORPG with me. The realization that if I stayed on my high-level character, they were hours away from anything we could do together relevant to both of us, and if I started a new character, we would both be hours away from anything remotely challenging worth teaming up on. Now, this is an issue with the linear nature of constant power gain in an RPG set in a multiplayer world. If you balance content for a certain power level, it is impossible below and irrelevant above. You're essentially creating brackets of gameplay experience, and if both players aren't in the same bracket, they can't enjoy the game together. Imagine the impact on early game player retention if multiplayer games like Apex Legends or Minecraft or Fortnite or even League of Legends simply did not let high-level and low-level players play together. And if both players start again as low-level, they must both go through hours of early game experience before the multiplayer challenge opens up. The MMORPG combines the RPG-style gameplay with the online multiplayer element, and ironically, it does neither of these very well in the early to mid-game. If your endgame is dungeons, raids, and bosses, and your early game is 8 to 20 hours of fetch quests and kill X quests, you have not laid the foundation for what will eventually become your core gameplay loop, and so you can't teach the player the relevant skills they need to succeed within that gameplay loop. And if you're trying to team up with your friends and you can't until you've played many hours of single-player experience, then you're going to fall to the wayside against multiplayer games that encourage people teaming up from the very start. You're not playing to the strengths of the RPG, and you're not playing to the strengths of a multiplayer game. So how do we fix this? Well, one solution would just be to boost the new player to maximum, level scale them up to their friends and let them go and do a raid. This way their friend doesn't lose any progress and it skips the early game irrelevant grind and makes playing together effectively instant. But doing this brings up one of the most overlooked aspects of multiplayer content. It is remarkably scary for a new player to be thrown into multiplayer content with a level of responsibility you have not been trained for. The pressure of knowing other people are relying on you when you don't know what to do is quite intense. And when I say don't mean what to do, I don't mean specific boss mechanics, I mean a foundation understanding of your class, role, and skills within your team. Traditionally, the tank will use taunts to grab the trash mobs and then pop some mitigation while the DPS burns them down, but if you've been leveling a tank class and the early RPG experience is kill X, collect X, and talk to NPCs, you won't have experienced needing to taunt, mitigate, or manage aggro for other players. A similar thing happens for healers. Healing yourself is very different to healing others, and knowing to prioritize the tank is something that we all take for granted, but a new player won't know. Even DPS players know you need to focus the enemy healers first or the fight is going to be longer, but common sense to us is actually years worth of solidified knowledge and is not obvious to a new player. So what we can ideally start looking at is a low stakes but highly educational experience within the early game of an MMORPG that new players and old players can access together that will place them both onto a relatively simple, level playing field, potentially scaling the higher players down to make sure they're not overpowered. It will give the new players foundation knowledge of what the end game is going to become. It will allow them to experience their class and their role and responsibility within a party of players, hopefully giving them the confidence to step away from this training dungeon into a more complex, difficult endgame experience. It doesn't need to be anything complex within the narrative of the world. Maybe the king is recruiting for guards and has created a training course where the players need to navigate some dangerous terrain, fight some trash mobs, and then kill a boss, and you've got a variety of enemies, healers, ranged damage dealers, crowd control mechanics. And as you progress through, there are NPC trainers explaining the situation to you and which of your specific skills you will need to complete this challenge most effectively. You are effectively hiding a class and dungeon tutorial within the narrative of learning how to be a guard. This training dungeon doesn't need to be super complex, it just needs to be challenging enough for a new player to feel trained, tested, and then rewarded. And hey, if you're still nervous about your role within a group with other players, this dungeon can have AI-controlled bots filling the roles you're not playing, and you could have them explaining why they're doing what they're doing so you understand their roles as well. And if you're still unsure about the potential for this system, consider this. A maxed level player will often finish a new dungeon or raid, having fought side by side with their friends, then they'll sit back and think, that was awesome, because that is what their game can be. Now, as a new player, what moments have made you sit back and think, that was awesome? It's unlikely to be the 15th Kill 15 Bears quest, and yet this is the vast majority of early game experiences. If new players cannot have engaging, awesome experiences with their old friends because there's no content bracket they both share, or they're too nervous to level boost, they will try to convince their old friends to start new characters. And if the old friends kindly do this, they'll then realise those awesome multiplayer moments are hours and hours away, replaced by the not very awesome experience of grind, which is a shame. Let's look into combining the strengths of the RPG, foundation experiences building into greater challenges, and the multiplayer elements of multiplayer games, easy to join groups, by building the endgame foundation from the start and letting players experience it together. Your game shouldn't begin at endgame. It may become extremely challenging at endgame, that's fine, that's actively encouraged, but it needs to start preparing the players for that challenge from the beginning. New players want to look at the most challenging content like dungeons and raids, stuff they can't do yet, and then they want to look at what they're currently doing and be able to see relevance or connection. They want to hear the amazing stories from their friends and then go have similar adventures or experiences knowing they are working toward them. If your game ultimately becomes something because that something is the best your game can be, then versions of that something need to be available for all players throughout the game. The MMORPG is a fascinating genre which more often than not, unfortunately, combines the weaknesses of all of its individual parts, when instead it needs to start combining the strengths. The strengths of the RPG being you can create your own character, your own class, your own series of answers for the questions and challenges the game is going to throw at you. And the strengths of the multiplayer element, the ability to go on this adventure with your friends or with the rest of the community at large, available extremely early in the game. Group content is vital to the survival of an MMORPG. Group content should not be a reward for enduring the early solo content. Group content should be a vital and accessible part of your game from the start. But what do you think? Should dungeons and raids be available from early in the game, or should they remain a reward for finishing the rest of the game? Are they a useful training tool, or should players know what they're doing before even joining? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers for watching. Another massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You can support from only £1 a month. Check the video description for links to the Patreon, Twitch, Twitter and Discord. And as always, have a great day.